A profession. Dangerous, masculine, remote. Two men employed in that profession, bonding over the dangers. A woman, strong, independent, feminine, who comes between them. That is the basic blueprint of a Howard Hawks movie. Howard Hawks was what I consider to be a second-generation filmmaker. The first generation were people like D.W. Griffith and John Ford, people who made feature films in 1915. Howard Hawks began in 1926 with The Lost, The Road to Glory. He made another film called Road to Glory several decades later that has nothing to do with the original, but he started right before the start of the sound era. So given the 10 years experience that people like Griffith and Ford had over Hawks, I consider Hawks to be second generation. What Hawks was doing while the first generation was working was getting a mechanical engineering degree from Cornell, winning a tennis championship, and teaching pilots how to fly during World War I. He never flew combat missions himself, but that tie to aviation and to the brotherhood of the skies, especially when it comes to combat pilots, painted his entire career. He made movies about men in dangerous professions and the women who come between them. And his movies are really, really good. But Hawks himself seems to have been largely forgotten by the film culture at large. Those who are kind of obsessed with film history know him and know him fairly well because he is a fairly large figure through the 30s and 40s and even 50s and even into the 60s. He had a very long career. But because his movies don't have a distinct visual style, the film community tends to push him aside in favor of people like Orson Welles or Alfred Hitchcock. And I find that deeply unfortunate. Hawks was not some sort of self-conscious artiste. He just wanted to tell stories that interested him in the film medium, and he was just really, really good at it, and I don't see anything wrong with that. He filmed things in a very classical, plain style with a very intimate knowledge of how close-ups, medium shots, and long shots work, and he used them extremely effectively, and that's not a bad thing. However, when it comes to the appreciation of film history, people tend to gravitate towards those filmmakers who were most influenced by German Expressionism. Ford, Hitchcock, Welles, all deeply influenced by the heavy use of light and shadow and artificial sets that German Expressionism brought to life in the Weimar era, when money was very tight and they still wanted to make grand sights and sounds in the late sound era. And so for those filmmakers who don't follow in that path, who don't make movies that are drenched in shadow all of the time, they tend to get forgotten. And it shouldn't be the case. Howard Hawks made great movies, and in my mind, that's all we really need from someone like Howard Hawks. We just need him to make great movies. So Howard Hawks was an independent before independent cinema was really any sort of dominant force in Hollywood. The independent scene really began in the 50s with people like Burt Lancaster forming their own independent production companies. But Hawks started in the 20s, and he worked through the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and into the 60s. And he's still something of an independent. He wrote out contracts. His early contract was with Warner Brothers, but he butted heads with studio executives so much around production processes. He tended to emphasize improvisation over sticking to a script, working with actors to find scenes, which was never something that studio executives really liked. They greenlit a script, they filmed this script. The most famous example, which I'll dig into a bit later, is Come and Get It, which he made for independent producer Samuel Goldwyn. However, because of this independent streak, but he was still making good movies that made money, he never really went out of favor, despite having some sort of antagonistic relationship with studio executives. He wrote out the end of his original Warner Brothers contract by being loaned out to other studios. So this is where something like Scarface happens under Howard Hawks, even though he was under contract with Warner Brothers. And once he wrote out his contract with Warner Brothers, he would essentially go from studio to studio, getting very short contracts, 1, 2, 3 picture deals, making the movies, and then going off. And sometimes under those deals, he would still be loaned out because he butted heads with producers so much. What he ended up creating through all of these experiences was a very wide-ranging filmography that hit a bunch of different genres. So he comes along in the 40s and makes something like The Big Sleep. It's a very typical noir. It is one of the best examples of the entire genre. And it kind of just feels like Howard Hawks had the inclination to try his hand at making a film noir, went in, did it, made one of the best examples of the genre, and then went out again, never to make another noir. And what did he follow that up with? He followed it up with Red River, a Western. He had never made a Western before. And so he went in, largely copied John Ford's overall style and made one of the best Westerns. And the Western with John Wayne's central performance that convinced John Ford that John Wayne actually had the ability to act. And again, he didn't make another Western for 20 years or so. He just walked into a genre, owned it, and walked out. That is incredibly hard to do. I've watched filmmakers walk into genres that they were unfamiliar with and just fumble with awful examples. John Huston comes to mind. His thrillers are generally terrible, but he was actually a fairly good filmmaker. He just couldn't make thrillers. He didn't know how to do it. But Howard Hawks just walked into any genre and just made it completely his own. And what his own is really centers around the idea of dangerous men and dangerous professions and the women who come between them. Now, one of the things that people tend to prioritize when it comes to filmmakers is the ability to work in different genres. I think Stanley Kubrick tends to be kind of the baseline around this because Kubrick worked in a bunch of genres. He did horror, he did sci-fi, he did a costume piece, and people love his movies, so therefore great filmmakers should be able to work in completely different genres. However, Kubrick has a very distinct visual style which people latch onto, so they tend to prioritize someone like Kubrick over someone like Hawks. Hawks, while working in different genres, was kind of making the same movie over and over again. Out of all of the filmmakers I've seen that I've really dug into, he is probably the second most repetitive of all filmmakers that I've seen. The other would be the Japanese filmmaker Yasujiro Ozu, who essentially just kept making the same movie about a middle-aged widowed parent trying to give away their young adult daughter to marriage. And you know what? There was nothing wrong with that. Those movies are great. They just kind of get better every single time he retells them. And it becomes a very similar thing with Howard Hawks. So the example I always come to is the dual movies of Ceiling Zero and Only Angels Have Wings. Ceiling Zero and Only Angels Have Wings are the same movie. They're set in different locations. One is mountain-based, the other is equatorial in South America, but they have essentially the same characters going through the exact same story beats and coming to the same conclusion. So he pretty much just remade Ceiling Zero when he made Only Angels Have Wings. Does that mean that Only Angels Have Wings is inferior to Ceiling Zero because Ceiling Zero came first? No. Only Angels Have Wings is a masterpiece and one of his best movies. Ceiling Zero is a pretty good adventure movie. He did it much better the second time around. And just to throw some grit under the mill, John Ford actually made the movie first, called Airmail. But Howard Hawks just took the basic story beats, he took the basic characters, and he infused a greater level of attention to detail, a greater level of attention to performance, and just kind of overall better craft informed by his increased experience to make a better film. And there's nothing wrong with trying to revisit that over and over again. And he ends up putting it in completely different arenas as well. So something like Red River is about two men, a father and his adopted son, doing a hard job of cattle driving, and the woman who comes between them. Rio Bravo is about two men in a dangerous profession trying to keep a town safe from bandits, and the woman who comes between them. Hatari is about men doing a dangerous profession, wrangling large game animals live, and the woman who comes between them. And he just repeats himself over and over and over and over again. And the difference is the setting, the pacing. His later films, much more languid, much more character focused than his earlier films, which tend to clip along at a kind of typical golden age of Hollywood pace. And he kept doing it over and over again with very, very good results. Now, I do think this comes to bite him in the very end of his career. His last handful of films are essentially just Rio Bravo over and over and over again. One of those is Hatari, which I love. But when he keeps hiring John Wayne and he keeps making them westerns with things like Rio Lobo, it's just decreased results as time goes on. It just doesn't quite work at that very late stage in his career when Howard Hawks himself just kind of feels tired. You know, it no longer feels like finding a new way to tell a story he appreciates. It just ends up feeling like an easy way to make another movie and keep himself busy for a few months late in his life. So let's talk visuals for just a second. So I mentioned before that Howard Hawks tends to film things in very plain classical styles with an emphasis on medium shots. He tends to use close-ups very rarely. In Red River, there are only a handful at one particular moment fairly early. And the rest of the time, it's medium shots after long shots kind of establish the scene. And he just knows how to do it very well. He's not filling frames with shadows, he's filling frames with characters, and he's filling those characters with life by improvising with his actors and finding emotional truth. And that emphasis on character and story above all else gives his movies this longevity that really benefits them. They aren't there to be showcases for the director. Those can be very fun. Think of something like Throne of Blood by Kurosawa. That is purely a director's showcase, but it's very, very fun and very watchable and has stood the test of time. But Hawks and his focus on making things about characters really helps give them life well beyond their original release. You know, so even something that can be really, really timely, like Sergeant York, which was made in the run-up to World War II about Sergeant York, who was a sniper during World War I, you know, and has this very obvious subtext of being a call to arms for young men watching the film, and apparently it worked really well. People signed up afterwards. But it still stands the test of time as this intimately drawn story of a young religious pacifist who decides that the gun is the only way to save his fellow Americans. And it works extraordinarily well. Now, we have to come to that visual aspect again, where he doesn't have that particular visual style, and there's a very interesting example in the middle of his career. I mentioned before the film Come and Get It, which he made for Samuel Goldwyn. And he actually only made about 75% of it. He was doing his normal thing, he was improvising with his actors, he was going way off script. Goldwyn was pissed. He hated what Hawks was doing. And so he fired Hawks and he brought in William Wyler. Now, I'm going to talk about William Wyler in another video. I love William Wyler. I think he actually is very visually distinctive, but not influenced by German Expressionism. So his visual distinctiveness ends up a less showy way. You know, you don't have the shadows, you don't have the vibrant colors that came in when the industry moved to color. What you have is very precise, exacting framing that worked in 3 dimensions. One of his favorite set designs was kind of an open space interior where you could see the second level in the background. And so what he would do is he would populate a very long shot of the space with 5 or 6 characters, and you could see all of them in perfect focus, but they would be at different distances, heights to the camera. So you'd have like 3 on the ground floor, 1 on the stairs, and a couple up top, and you could see them all. And then he would actually move the camera. He'd dolly it 15 feet to the right or something, and everyone would move, and then everyone would rest again in another perfectly framed shot that took advantage of the 3 dimensions. And you know, you can compare that to my descriptions of how Howard Hawks made his films, and they don't jive, but they both directed the same movie. And so Come and Get It becomes this really interesting example where you can kind of clearly see where William Wyler took over. The framing goes from largely functional, which is, again, not a bad thing, to slightly more ornate. Wyler didn't have the time working with Goldwyn that he would have at his home studio of Warner Brothers making things like Jezebel, so he couldn't go quite as ornate as he normally would. He didn't design the sets, but you can just tell, like, the framing becomes more complicated. There are people at different distances from the camera more commonly. And I think, and yet the movie has this uniformity of story, despite Hawks's constant improvisation, despite the fact that Wyler didn't reshoot anything. He just took over from the script and went from there. The film actually follows through very clearly to a very well-earned emotional ending. And I think it's a testament to, well, it's a testament to both of their skills. I don't want to just praise Hawks when it comes to Come and Get It, because Wyler had the difficult job of picking up the pieces and moving forward. And the movie is really good. It's like shockingly good considering the production history. But it's a testament to how Hawks's plain visual stylings don't actually detract from any of his filmmaking. You know, again, he's not some sort of self-conscious artiste trying to make, you know, visually interesting things just to make them. He's a storyteller, and that's his primary concern, finding the characters within a story and kind of sending them on their way. And so Hawks becomes just this deeply, deeply underappreciated filmmaker the more time goes on. People will remember his films. Don't get me wrong. People will remember Red River, The Big Sleep, To Have and Have Not, Sergeant York, and a dozen others. You know, he has a musical in there, Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. He has a musical with Jane Russell and Marilyn Monroe in the middle of his filmography. And it works really well. He didn't actually direct the musical sequences, but overall it's this light, fun adventure with Marilyn Monroe and Jane Russell. And it's like, one of the hardest things to do is just walk in and do comedy. But he also had that great hand at comedy as well. He almost single-handedly invented the screwball comedy with Bringing Up Baby. But he also has His Girl Friday, which is heavily screwball comedy-ish, although it kind of ends on a more serious note. Things like Man's Favorite Sport, which, you know, is a late-stage comedy. It's not, you know, Bringing Up Baby, but it's pretty funny. And Monkey Business, which just is this marvelous showcase for Ginger Rogers. You know, Cary Grant is in it, and he gets to play as a kid a bunch, but Ginger Rogers just proves that she is this magnificent physical comedic talent, and Howard Hawks helped bring that to life. Now, another thing about His Girl Friday, it just kind of tying it into his visual style, is that Howard Hawks' movies tend to move very quickly, especially early in his career. And yet His Girl Friday is built on very, very long takes. Howard Hawks understood pacing at a level that people kind of only dream. Pacing isn't something I talk about very much because I think it usually ends up a placeholder for other complaints. I don't think people quite understand it as well as they think they do. But Hawks really did understand pacing. And so when he has 2 to 3 minute long shots of Rosalind Russell and Cary Grant sniping at each other, and they're talking so fast that you can barely keep up, that is a very conscious decision on Howard Hawks' part about how to direct his actors and how to frame a scene. He could have accomplished that in a more modern way, today modern, of having a lot of intercuts, you know, filming one person talking quickly, alone, in a single shot, filming the other person talking alone, quickly, in a single shot, and then cutting between them, overlapping dialogue slightly. But he does it all in one long take, and he does it again and again and again throughout the film, so that people are just constantly talking over each other, and yet it's still surprisingly clear. And the jokes just land. You know, you have to know who Ralph Bellamy is to get at least one of the jokes, because he is an actor in it, and Cary Grant says he looks like Ralph Bellamy, and it's just so out of nowhere that it's just kind of funny. But it's so fast-paced that it's like, even if you don't get it, you're just moving on to the next. It's essentially the Airplane mentality. You know, it's like, just make a joke and move on. If they don't get that one, they'll get the next one. And so here's Hawks. You know, he's making film noirs, he's making westerns, he's making comedies, he's making movies about flying. The Dawn Patrol, the original Dawn Patrol that he directed, is great. It's his first full surviving sound film, and it is technically impressive at a time when someone like John Ford was making a complete fool of himself with The Black Guard. And Hawks just like walked into any genre. He completely mastered the mechanics of the genre while still making it entirely his own, almost always making his movies about men in dangerous professions and the women who come between them. That's far from anything to sneeze at. He was great at this. And the fact that, you know, people can remember some of his movies, but they don't appreciate Hawks as an artist, makes me sad. You know, I love Alfred Hitchcock, I love Orson Welles, I love John Ford. They're all great filmmakers. But Howard Hawks really stands among them, and in some cases probably stands above them. And that should be appreciated. You know, you should appreciate the chameleon director, the director who can walk in and stylistically adopt the trappings of a genre without making the film visually his, but still making it thematically his. And the example of Howard Hawks and William Wyler, who has gone through a similar posthumous fate, is why I kind of think that Steven Spielberg is going to experience a similar fate. You know, it's like, oh my gosh, you can't ignore Spielberg. Well, people have been ignoring Spielberg for more than a decade. They don't go to his movies anymore. But in addition, people are going to remember Raiders of the Lost Ark. People are going to remember Schindler's List. I don't think they're going to remember Spielberg the same way that they remember Alfred Hitchcock. They're going to remember him the same way they remember Howard Hawks. Which is to say, they'll be familiar with the name. They'll say, oh, I guess I like some of his movies if you list them. But they won't think of Spielberg himself as an artist because he won't have that kind of obvious visual flair that people tend to gravitate towards. And, you know, just imagine, you know, you're talking to someone in 20 years, talking about how Steven Spielberg was great, and they're like, oh, who? Oh, yeah, Raiders of the Lost Ark. Yeah, I liked that movie. But Steven Spielberg, who is that? Imagine that. That's kind of what I feel like when I talk to people about Howard Hawks. A very real conversation I had once was about Red River with someone, some random person online, and they were struggling with the categorization problem. You know, I look at Red River, this person says, and I don't see a visual stamp. I can't look at any frame and say, that's Howard Hawks. And so to this person, what really defined a great filmmaker was that visual stamp that made any frame within a film incredibly obviously Hawksian. And I just feel like it's a silly mantra. It's a silly metric. It shouldn't really apply. That is a potential aspect of great filmmaking, you know, kind of making the frame itself visually distinctive to oneself. But a lot of the times what makes things distinctive to a particular artist has nothing to do with the visual and has everything to do with other elements of storytelling, like character, like theme. Hell, someone like Robert Bresson has an incredibly distinctive editing style that becomes incredibly obvious when you watch it. But if I just pull out a frame, it's just a guy standing in a doorway. So Hawks kind of feels like a lost gem. A great filmmaker that people seem to have largely forgotten, while remembering some of his movies fondly. And if I can do anything with this grand YouTube experience, it's get a few more people to check out Howard Hawks movies. So, I'm David with the Director Series, and that was Howard Hawks. Until next time.